Okay, so someone probably told you when you buy moccasins, you should buy them a size smaller and they should fit pretty tight. And you thought, surely they didn't mean this tight. I'm gonna buy a size up. And then you went home and you walked in them for 2 days and now they're too big. So what do? I have 3 methods for you. One is no sewing, one is a little bit of sewing, and one is a fair bit of sewing to get your moccasins to fit you again. Let's get started. Part 1, no sewing. Okay, our first method is the NoSew method. I have traced my foot onto a piece of paper here. I made sure it was the left foot because that is the shoe I need to make smaller. Now I'm going to cut that out, smoothing out the bumps as I go. Now that I have that, I'm going to lay it on a nice thick piece of wool or felt or even foam. I've done it before with 1/2 inch piece of high density foam. We are making an insole. Pretty low tech way of making shoes fit, but hey, whatever works. Pin that in place and then I will cut that one out. Now that I have that, I would put that in my moccasin and see if it fits better yet. If it doesn't, layer more insoles on top and then either use a spray adhesive to keep them all together in a stack or do a quick whip stitch all around the end. Whip stitch picture is up in the corner of the screen right now in case you don't know what I'm talking about. And so for today, that's the way I'm going to do this one. Now, of course, you would stack up as many layers as you need to get it to fit, or you can just use something that's thicker to begin with, like felt or foam. I used big sloppy stitches here for a reason, actually 2 reasons. The first is that this was meant to be for non-sewers, this method. So if you're a non-sewer and you did stitching this good, way to go. Otherwise, please use adhesive or just a thicker material, as I've said. The second reason I did these big sloppy stitches is because in our third method, where we have lots of sewing, I'm going to be inserting this inside the moccasin and you will never see them anyway. All we need is for those layers to stay together. So that is it for method 1. You would just put the insole in, try your moccasin on, and see if it fits now. Part 2, a little bit of sewing. You might use this method with the new insole to make your moccasin fit just a little bit better around the ankle, now that it's fitting in the foot. The first thing we need to do is flip the fur back to the inside like it was when you very first attached it. Now we can see here where this ankle wants to kind of grow outward and we want to bring it back in. And we're going to do that with a piece of elastic. I've got my 1/4 inch elastic here and I'll show you how to measure it. We're not going to put it across the top, only around the ankle here. I'll measure it first without stretching it at all. So I know the distance around this part of the moccasin is this long. It doesn't really matter what this measurement is. I'll cut that off. Now I want to cut this down to 3/5 of what it is now. I will draw in some marks to divide my elastic into 5ths. If you want to measure it and divide it, you go for it. And I'm going to take 2 of those 5ths off. Okay, I've got 3/5 left. Next up, I'll fold it in half and use a pin to mark where the midpoint is. Using my binder clips, again, these are 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch baby binder clips, super handy when working with leather. I'm going to clip that center point to my center back seam. And I can now remove the pin. Then I will stretch this around to here and clip it together where the vamp meets the sole of the moccasin. Same thing on the other side. Now you may think that's extreme kind of pressure on the leather, but the leather isn't that responsive to actually caving in under the pressure of the elastic, which is why we really give it a lot to work with here. Now I can see where a couple more clips need to go. There we are. See how it's pulling it in? This will make your moccasin sit nicer on your ankle. Now I'll use a simple whip stitch again to stitch this together using a leather needle and leather thread. If you need any help with supplies, please check out my moccasin supplies video. It has all of these things already in it, so you would have a full kit for repairs, resizing, and making moccasins. The link to that supplies video is up in the corner of the page right now. All right, I've got my leather needle, my leather thread. My thread is knotted at the end and I'm ready to sew. Again, a simple whip stitch, which just means coming from the same side every time, but moving a little bit each stitch. I'm aiming for the center of the elastic here, and I'm going to do 3 stitches in the same place to start it off, so I know that that elastic won't come out down the road. Now that that's secure, I'll continue all the way around the back of the foot. Before I flip that fur back out, let's just take a look at how we've changed how that moccasin will hug the ankle of the wearer. All right, we'll flip the fur back out and you'll never know that we made any changes, except that it's stretchy now. Part 3. I highly recommend watching the moccasin assembly video before diving into this one. This one is a lot of sewing. This one is like minor surgery. Now we're going to do the minor surgery method. So if adjusting the depth of the foot with an insole wasn't enough to make them fit, if adding elastic around the ankle wasn't enough to make them fit, what we need to do then, because we've adjusted the circumference and the height, all that's left is the length or the width. Width is really hard to adjust. We're just not going to. We're going to adjust the length. To do that, we have to start by taking apart our center back seam and our heel seam. This is a seam ripper. We haven't talked about these before. If you sew, you already know what this is. If you don't sew, it's just a little thing for cutting the threads in our work, but not cutting our work. All right, I've released the heel seam, the center back seam from the lining, and I released that elastic that we just put on in method 2. Everything goes back to a distance of about 2 inches from center back. Now we can see the lining heel coming out here. We want to similarly take out the stitching in the heel flap, but we don't have to take out the center back stitching. All we need to do is do another row of back stitch further in from that one. So if you speak sewing language, we're increasing the seam allowance, we're doubling the seam allowance. If you don't speak sewing language, what I just meant is we're going to use up more of that lining fabric into the seam here so that the shoe itself becomes smaller. Now, if you need help remembering what a back stitch is, check out my video link for hand stitches. I will give you a quick tutorial here. Back stitch just means we go backwards before we go forwards. If you're nervous about sewing in a straight line, you can of course mark this with a piece of chalk or a pencil before you begin. There it is. So I chose to do about an extra ½ inch. You will choose to do whatever it was that you needed to pinch out when you put your foot in there, how much excess there was at the back. That's how much you need to add to that seam allowance. Okay. That's the center back seam of the lining done. Now we need to deal with the heel. So because we've sewn this up smaller, we've made the distance at the heel here smaller, and we are just going to cheat by cutting off 2 slivers on either side of the heel and then folding them in to the middle before we fold the heel seam up, and then it magically matches again. Thank you, math. Now, just like we did when you originally put these together, I'll use a whip stitch or a felling stitch, which is done by sliding the needle under the heel flap, then picking up a sliver of fabric from the heel and then sliding back under the heel flap again. And I'm going to repeat that all the way around the heel. There it is. There's my new, shorter lining heel. Now here comes the fun part. Remember we made this ugly insole? We can now sneak it in here between the lining and the leather. No one will know it's there. No one will see it, but it'll help our moccasins fit better and keep our feet toasty warm. Matching up nicely with my heel and my lining. Now, how are we going to get this back together so that it's inside out? First thing we need to do is remove this little leather strip and keep it because we're going to reuse it. Before we put this back together, let's take off that extra 1/4 inch from each side that we decided was too much. Again, you can mark this with chalk or pencil if you're nervous about just freehanding it. There it is. And now that that's been shortened, we can reattach our leather strip by whip stitching it to one side of our back. With our little leather strip attached, we want to re-sew this back together in a way that the seams appear tidy. To do that, I'm going to hold each side of the back, flip the moccasin over, and pull those two center back edges together. If it seems weird, don't worry about it. It'll make sense very shortly. I'm going to clip them because they don't want to be there, but I'm the boss. And there they shall go. Okay, I'm going to sew this together using a locking whip stitch, just like I did when I very first made these moccasins. Now that that back is sewn together, I can flip it back to the right side, pull the heel flap out. Now we can trim this down just as it was in our original moccasins. Just a note, I think when we first made these, I did an extra back stitch on that seam. If you want to do that for strength, you go ahead. Now when we look at the heel, see where it wants to roll here and here? I will just cut down to that roll on each side. Tuck these extra ends away and fold up the flap for a nice clean finish. Just like we did for the lining, I'm going to sew this shut. As you may have noticed by now, I like doing things in an orderly fashion. So now that the back is fully put together, I'm going to reattach the moccasin layer by layer. First up, attaching the lining to the leather. Now that the lining's reattached, I want to attach the fur. You may be alarmed when you realize we shrunk down the lining and the leather, but we didn't shrink the fur. And that's because we actually just don't care as much. The fur is fluffy. It will hide a larger seam allowance just where we need it. It'll create a little bit of a pleat, but we'll never see that. It'll be disguised in all the fur. You can see here I've reached the center back seam on the leather, but not on the fur. So I know exactly how much of that fur I need to pleat over and just keep sewing. Now that that's done, all that's left is to reattach our elastic. Same thing here. I know we didn't proportionately reduce the amount of elastic, but it's elastic. It's fine. Once the elastic is on, we can flip the fur back to the outside as though nothing happened. And now we have a moccasin at least one size smaller. And now we've got two matching smaller moccasins where there used to be two matching larger ones. Way to go, you're all done. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. I've got more to come.